Okay, so we're going to take a look at some of the behavioral changes that we see during the Pleistocene, and in particular here, what we're interested in is the control of fire. When hominins begin to use it consistently, or actually the very first evidence that we see in the archaeological record for fire. Now, I'll just remind you that the Pleistocene, it's a geological epoch, and it goes from 2.5 million years to 20,000 years ago, roughly. Right. Fire, it doesn't appear 2.5 million years ago, and so we're also interested in when we see the earliest evidence. We're also interested in who was using fire and what evidence we have for that. And we're also interested in, well, how do we know that humans were using fire at this point of time in human history? Okay, so we're going to move on to the next slide and begin to look at this in a little more depth to supplement some of the material that we have in our readings. All right, in 2006, Wrangham writes a book called Catching Fire. Ironically, it came out at the same time as Catching Fire, the novel, and perhaps they share a similar theme, Prometheus giving humans fire and development and change afterwards, but two very different books. This one's anthropological. Now, Wrangham, he's taking a look at the role that cooking has played in producing humankind. And it is a really important idea. And it takes us really to two different levels when we're looking at cooking. We have that archaeological. Put an O in there. We have that archaeological content because we're looking at artifacts, evidence for cooking. In addition to that, when we're talking about what makes us human on that biological level, we're doing physical anthropology. We'll just put physical anthro there. So we're looking at the interrelationship between ultimately culture and biology. And we know this concept. We've referred to it as that interplay between biology, culture, and we call it bioculturalism in anthropology. Now, when it comes to humans, we've already pointed out that bipedalism, that's one of the unique features that makes us different from other animals. In addition to bipedalism, and like I pointed out, with the exception of ostriches, humans are the only animals that use bipedal type of locomotion. And we did so we could begin to exploit new environments. It emerged by chance randomly. It wasn't that we said we need to develop in a different way. That's just not the way evolution takes place. But by chance, bipedalism emerges, survival of the fittest, natural selection, all of that stuff that we've talked about, and we get two-legged walking. In addition to bipedalism, we also have cooking. And this is something that only humans do. Now, there's a really important relationship here because cooking, it plays a profound role in shaping the development of the brain. So when we look at earlier species, and we've talked a little bit about this already, if we go back to the Australopithecines, we're seeing on average in those Australopithecines a brain that's about the size of 390 milliliters. As we move along from those Australopithecines to Homo habilis, we're seeing on average about 600 mil. So we're seeing some changes. And what we had pointed out is with Homo habilis, meat was being introduced to that diet, and that was playing a role in the development of the brain and that expensive tissue hypothesis that we had talked about. When we move to Homo erectus, we see an absolute jump in cranial capacity, 950 milliliters. Now, remember, Charles Darwin, he said evolution was a slow and gradual process. We see these changes from about 600 mil to 950 mil take place in about 500,000 years. 500,000 years. That's fast evolution. And we refer to this in anthropology as punctuated equilibrium theory. Okay, so really what it says is sometimes evolution speeds up, and we want to know why it speeds up. What has happened? And here it's going to take us to the subject of cooking. All right, so in our readings, we have a question, or at least a topic heading on that WordPress article, the third leap, and it says, who cooked first? One of the things that we pointed out in asking this question of who cooked first, we obviously saw that Homo habilis, okay, Homo habilis, it certainly used tools. There's no question about that. This is, and like I said, there is some evidence suggesting that perhaps some Australopithecines also manufactured tools, but undeniably the handyman is associated with tools, and we had pointed out that those tools were called Oldowan tools, or the Oldowan tradition. And in looking at those tools, we had pointed out that they were primarily designed for getting at meat. And this represented one of those first changes in the human diet, where we had moved from a strictly vegetarian diet, probably supplemented with insects as well. And that certainly was there, and things that we could grab. But by and large, it was a vegetarian diet. The tools illustrate that we began to get at food in a new way. And I had pointed out that Homo habilis, it wasn't a hunter. It was a scavenger. And we had said when we look at the tools and the Oldowan sites in association with meat, we can see that they're really hacking off the meat. And in addition to being a scavenger, we see no evidence of cooking. Now, how do we know that? Well, one of the things that takes place in addition, if you cook something, you can imagine that you do get that charring on the bone. But the other thing about bone, I'm going to go up to the top here. So one of the things that we'd see is a black charred type of surface as well. But the other thing about bone is it also turns gray when it's heated. And we just don't see that in association with Homo habilis. And we'd pointed out that Homo habilis emerges at about 2.5 million years ago and becomes extinct. I'm going to put it down on the other side here at about 1 million years of age. The individual that was responsible for cooking we refer to as Homo erectus. And we had talked about their tools, and we had called the tools the Julian tradition. And we said designed for meat, but there are some fundamental changes in the ways that these tools were constructed, showing us a different way of thinking. Now, Homo erectus, it emerges around 2 million years ago, roughly speaking, and becomes extinct probably around 500,000 years ago, or 0.5 MYA. Homo erectus not only used tools, but also cooked. They're the first individuals that began to control fire. And that's what we're going to look at here. We're going to look at some of the archaeological sites associated with Homo erectus and the evidence that tells us that they were using fire. We need to ask, how do we know that Homo erectus was the master chef? The evidence that anthropologists have been able to provide in answering this particular question, that Homo erectus was in fact using fire, comes from a cave system in South Africa referred to as the Wonderwerk Cave. The Wonderwerk Caves are important because it illustrates that by 1 million years ago, we have the earliest evidence of cooking. And later on, we start to see the development of hearths, for example. Now, the way that the anthropologists got at this question of whether or not Homo erectus was cooking was taking a look at this cave system that had been occupied by Homo erectus, and they had discovered ashes in the dirt. Now, if we think about ashes discovered in soil that go back a million years, the question is, how did those ashes get into the soil in a cave system? Now, outside of the cave system, you could say, yeah, fires, they occur naturally. That's part of nature. But in a cave, how would a fire begin deep in a cave? The conclusion here is it needs to be purposeful. Whoever was using that cave was creating fires there as well. So the next step became, can we find any evidence of cooking? Can we find, for example, bone in the ashes? And that's exactly what they were able to discover. Discovered burned bones and those ashes. So now, if you think about it, what's the likelihood of a fire starting inside of a cave, deep inside of a cave, and an animal running into that fire and just hanging out there and dying? That doesn't make a lot of sense. So once we put these pieces together, we have to say by 1 million years ago, yes, we do have some good evidence that suggests that Homo erectus, it was cooking, and yeah, it's the master chef. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, so you might be wondering, how are we associating this stuff with Homo erectus? How are we associating with the Acheulean stone tool tradition? So what I want you to do is think back to the Leakeys and Olduvai Gorge, and we had looked at the various beds. Bed 1, for example, which was the oldest deposited material, and there we found evidence of Homo habilis, and then as we begin to move up, we find more recent information. And because we have volcanic material there, we're able to date that volcanic material and get an absolute date. Okay, so, and the other thing is the artifacts that we find. So here, what we're looking at is an example, and when I bought this on eBay, I was told that this was an Acheulean hand axe. I'm not so sure about that, but either way, I'm going to believe that it is, and I'm going to believe that it's about 1 million years of age. And this is what we find there. So what we're finding in association with evidence of cooking is that Acheulean tool tradition. The only logical conclusion is, well, it certainly wasn't Homo habilis that was using fire, because they're in a different bed, right? They're in a different layer of the earth in that strata. When we look at the stratigraphy, they're further down. And when we look at their tools, we don't find it in association with any type of burning that would be indicative of anthropogenic fire use. Okay, so that's kind of a big word. We'll talk about that shortly. Anthropogenic. In other words, created by humans. So certainly there's situations where there are natural fires. And that's what we need to begin to distinguish when we're looking at this. A natural fire versus human created fire. And in the layers and associated with the artifacts that we're interested in connecting. Okay, let's move to the next slide. I'll see you over there. Here's an example of this cave system. So when I said fire isn't going to start naturally here, I think you get a good impression of what I'm talking about. Somebody needed to move into this cave system and begin to use fire. And that's the other component. Fire allowed our hominin ancestors to move into regions like this. Without light, a cave is pretty scary. I've done some caving in the past, and my headlamp's gone out, and it's darn dark inside of there. There's no way I would move into a cave, progress into a cave, without a really good lamp system. The same thing goes, I think, for our hominin ancestors. They would have had fire. It would have allowed them to move into these caves and start to occupy them. Let's move to the next slide. All right, what we're looking at here is a map of South Africa, and I've already pointed out South Africa has a national park there, protected World Heritage Site that's referred to as the Cradle of Humankind, its official name. South Africa is one of the cradles of humankind, and right here we have the Wonderwerk Cave system. And it's here where we find the earliest evidence for fire. Now, we've dated this material to approximately 1 million years of age. Like I said, this is absolute dated. And what the archaeologists did here is they went deep into the cave system and they collected some sediment. And, the problem with sediment is it's going to fall apart. You need something to help bind it, and that's what they did. And some of this research came from the University of Toronto as well. So they took a polyresin composite, so they kind of hardened this sediment into a brick-like structure, and then they halved it, right? They cut it in half, and in doing so, they were able to see a cross-section of the material inside that sample that they were interested in examining. And when they examined this, they discovered burned bone under that microscopic analysis, and as we've already pointed out, bone becomes gray when it's heated. So here we have bone deep in a cave in the sediment that has, and we know it's being burned. The question is it possible for a fire to occur naturally deep in a cave? I don't think so, and nor do archaeologists. Here's where we're applying that critical thinking and the logic. We're looking at the materials and we're saying, is it possible for a fire to occur deep in a cave system? Yeah, elsewhere, sure, but not deep in a cave. And we've talked about anthropogenic fire, right? Anthropogenic from anthropos. This is human-created fire. We're not looking at a natural fire here, so the only conclusion is humans were cooking, and we have evidence of that charred bone, that burned bone, by at least 1 million years ago, and that's coming from the Wonderwerk Cave. On the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about Israel, where we find some really important information as well. It's a little more recent, and like I said here, if we've got 1 million years of age, over there we're moving in time by about 210,000 years, a little more recent, but it's at least placing it all in the same time frame and associating with the same species. So what species here are we interested in? And we'll just put it up top so we make sure we have that again. The species is Homo erectus. Okay, we're in a little bit of a time machine here. We've just sped up 210,000 years. In other words, we were just in Africa, and the material that we looked at there was traced to about 1 million years of age, and now we're in Israel, and we're tracing this to approximately 0.79 million years ago, or 790,000 years before the present. Now, this stuff that we're looking at, again, it's not associated with Homo habilis. Homo habilis is extinct by this period of time, and maybe a couple of them walking around, but that's what physical anthropology tells us. In addition to that, as I've pointed out, remember, Homo erectus is the first hominin to leave home, the first to exit. So that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing the movement of Homo erectus as some of those species begin to migrate around the world. And as we've already seen, they go much further than Israel. They reach the Far East, they reach England, they reach Spain, everywhere except for the New World, the Americas, and Australia. And that's also debatable because on those islands, we also find Homo erectus, so quite possibly they arrived there as well. Anyhow, looking at this particular site, Gesher, Benot, Cave, Israel, I hope I pronounced that correct. Absolute dated to 790,000 years before the present, or same thing as 0.790 MYA. Just preference. And here what we're seeing is evidence for anthropogenic fire, not naturally occurring fire. Okay, so the interesting thing here, and I'll just point it out there. There we are, Gesher. We're seeing evidence for anthropogenic fire, not naturally occurring fire, because we're seeing this fire in very specific locations. So again, think if we have natural fire, it's going to ravage an entire area. We're not going to see an indication of fire, for example. I'm going to highlight that right there, or some fire right there. Oh, that just disappeared on me. It's being funny. Or perhaps some fire there. that's really being difficult and frustrating. I'm going to play with it just for a little bit, just for fun, to see if it can beat me or if I can beat it. And I think I just won. All right, so natural fire, it's not going to be sporadic, very isolated. What we're going to see if there's an outbreak of fire, and here I'm going to go with a larger marker, what we're going to see really is just kind of scoring in an entire area. That's not what we see here. So what we do see at Gesher is burned seed, burned wood, burned flint, in very localized areas. So what this tells us is that there were designated hearth areas, areas where they were cooking on a regular basis. We're probably looking at a camp here. All right, so with respect to fire, I think in the same way that the ability to manufacture a tool is mostly human. You know, and I say mostly human because when we look at tools, a number of birds actually manufacture tools or modify sticks for specific purposes. There's no other animal that controls fire, that regularly uses it. So this is something that is uniquely human. And we've looked at the control of fire. And when we see control of fire, we've referred to it as anthropogenic or human made or created. Direct translation. Human made fire. And the earliest evidence we're always here associating with Homo erectus. Now this doesn't mean that species that followed didn't use fire. They most certainly did. But Homo erectus, it's the first species to do so. And our evidence comes from the Wonderwerk Cave system that's dated to approximately 1 million years of age. And then from Gesher, we'll just say BY, or else we can use a G, BY for short form, and that's dated to 0.790 million years of age, or translating 790,000 years before the present. Now, fire is really important. It allows, and as Wrangham said, it allows us to cook, and that creates drastic changes in our brain. And as our brain changes drastically, we see the emergence of more complex culture. So what we're going to start to see over time, and we're not going to talk about it here because this course in physical anthropology isn't going into symbolism and linguistics. We could, but we're not going to. And art. It's at this point of time when we have these changes in the human brain that it's going to become possible to think in abstract ways and to begin to eventually speak, paint on walls, create statues, and eventually, produce stuff like this that we can scribble on a blackboard that, well, is virtual ultimately. All right, so Homo erectus, a few key things. Homo erectus, we have the Wonderwerk Caves, 1 million years of age. We have Gesher, 790,000, and all of which is providing us with conclusive evidence of anthropogenic fire and cooking in a variety of different ways. All right, next slide is going to talk a little bit more about what fire allowed us to do, because in addition to cooking, it also allows us to move out to other areas. So we had talked about Homo erectus being the first to, and I'm just going to go next to it, the first to migrate out, and that shouldn't be a surprise. Why was Homo erectus able to move out of Africa into cooler areas? It had fire. And it also allowed them to begin to use those caves where we eventually start to see art emerge. Why? And caves can be quite cold because of fire. All right, let's move over to the next slide and we'll talk just briefly about some of the impact associated with fire. So a few questions here. Let's go through these. What species and at what point of time in our past used fire first? This is a great question for a test. And what we're going to say is it's Homo erectus, and it began to use fire around 1 million years ago. That evidence comes from the Wonderwerk Caves, so I might want to put that on the side. With respect to the second question, with the use of fire, where did hominins begin to sleep and why? Well, we've also touched on this. Dwelling in caves, it starts to become more common. Fire provides more control over the environment, warmth, and light. So now we're starting to create more comfortable environments and also offer ourselves some protection from the elements or predators outside of those caves. How did cooking impact our consumption and digestion of food? So now this goes back to Wrangham's research where he said cooking made us human. Cooking increased digestible protein. In the end, protein, it supplies our tissues. It allows them to grow while glucose is used by the brain. So over time, our brains got larger. And the other interesting thing about cooking, aside from creating more digestible protein or denaturing the proteins, it also detoxifies poisonous plants and therefore increases mineral and vitamin absorption. So cooking is a really good thing. If you look at any other individuals around the world that haven't cooked, you also have to have special adaptations in the stomach as well. For example, Inuit, they ate, for example, raw meat for a variety of reasons. And one of the more important reasons was they didn't have access to vitamin C. We do not synthesize our own vitamin C, so you've got to get it from somewhere else. And the Inuit got around this problem by eating raw meat. Fourth question, did the use of fire impact human migration patterns? If so, explain why and how. So here, what I'd want to say is it provides a mechanism to cope with cooler climes. And I'm going to leave the rest of this up to you. I'd like you to think back, did fire create an opportunity to move into different environments? And why do you think so based upon the material that you've been asked to read and the material that we've discussed? All right, that's where we're going to leave it. And for those that have stuck around for this whole lecture, I'm going to share a little bit of I don't know, a little bit of a feeling with you. We don't get the opportunity to really hang out here too much. I'm going to try to do something here. No, I don't know. Some eyes. He's got a kind of a big nose, a little bit of a beard. He's always got a big smile. Do you know what I'm thinking about? I'll tell you, sometimes I feel a whole lot like, not Grizzly Adams, that's how bad my drawing is, but I feel a whole lot like the American artist Bob Ross with his happy little forests and some of the mistakes I make. And, keeping that in mind, here we'll put a little bit of a palette in his hand. I'm just going to add that there, happy little palette with some green and maybe some blue over here and some happy little red. And look at that, our green disappeared. That's okay. We'll just put it back in there. Yeah, it's okay to be silly sometimes. Bob Ross. Sometimes I'm going to give him some eyebrows, some happy little eyebrows there. And I think one of the things that doing this online has taught me, you know what, it's okay to make some mistakes sometime and have a little more fun with the material and not be so serious about it. And I do like to be fun with it in the class, but sometimes when you hear yourself, you get a little bit of self-conscious about that. So I'm growing with this. And look, my greens disappeared one more time. I'm going to add in. No, I'm not going to add in anything. Okay, so we're going to leave it. We'll put some white in there and some purple. Look at that. Okay, that's where we're going to leave it for this lecture. Take care.